Daf Chaf Aleph Amud Aleph will begin Chaf Amud Beis, the last line. Rami Baravin Itron Psulta de Zift. It says Itron, what's called Itron. Itron is the residue of zephes, of pitch. Shaiva, wax, Psulta de Duvsha. It's the residue of honey. It's the wax, the honeycomb. After you remove the honey, the residue that's left over, the honeycomb, that's considered wax. Lamai nafkamina. What's the nafkamina? What is the point that we're trying to bring out with this? Lamekach ulamamkar. That if a person says that he makes an agreement that he's selling wax, for instance, he can give him the wax of the honeycomb. It doesn't have to be processed any further. The buyer cannot make a claim, cannot taina, well, this is not wax, this is not the wax that I had in mind. I had in mind that it would be wax that had to be further processed, not just the wax from the honeycomb, that it would be further processing and more refined. He can't make a taina when, in the Loshem Bnei Adam, when they say wax, it does include also the wax of the honeycomb. And therefore the sale is binding. And similarly, with Itron and Zephes, he cannot make a claim, the purchaser cannot make a claim that what I had in mind was not just with the psoilas of the Zephes, it's something that had further refining. He cannot make such a claim. Even though we said in the Mishnah you cannot use certain wicks and certain oils for fuel, for the lighting, for the candles for Shabbos, because we're concerned that it won't light properly, it'll flicker, it won't draw the oil properly. Yata, and he'll tilt it in order to increase the flame. However, that's only legabe the candles. But you could make a fire, bonfire, but you could make a bonfire, whether it's to warm yourself or for the light. There, we're not concerned that Shemiyata or Shemiyachata, we're not concerned with that because the fire is so large, it's such a large fire, it'll burn on its own and he will not have to make any adjustments. Bein al gabe karka, whether the bonfire is on the ground, bein al gabe kira, when this is a stove. The isser is only to make the wicks for a menorah, for a nair. But for a bonfire, there's no isser. You can't use shemen kik for fuel. My shemen kik, what is shemen kik? I asked the people to go down to the sea what it is. They told me there's a bird that's by the water, that lives by the water, and it's called a kik. So the oil that comes from this bird, the oil that comes from this bird, from this oif, the oil that's extracted from it, that's called shemen kik. Rabbi Yitzchak brings Rabbi Yehuda Amar Mishchat calls it. He says it's cotton seed oil. It's the oil that comes from extracting the seeds from cottonseed. Reish Lakish Amar Kikayin D'Yaina. It is for Kikayin D'Yaina. It is from the tree that's mentioned by Yaina Hanavi, the tree that gave him shade. That tree, that it's extracted from that tree, from the seeds of that tree. Amar Rabba Bar Bar Chana L'Didi Chazal Kikayin D'Yaina, or mentioned Kikayin D'Yaina. He said, I saw this tree. U'Salivis Dami. And it looks like the tree that's called U'Saliva, which has big, large, wide leaves. And that's what it looks like. And Umidapashche Rabbi, and it grows by the water. Va'alpum Chanusa Madlan Yosei. And they used to put it over the entranceways of the stores because it had a nice aroma and it gave shade. So it would be inviting for the people to come to the stores. And Parsudinu of the Mishcha. And from the seeds they make oil. And under the shade, the sick people used to recuperate and rest under the shade of this tree, this Kikayin D'Yaina. The wicks that the Chum said you cannot use for Shabbos, that are disqualified for the menorah on Shabbos, it's because like we mentioned, the flame flickers. It doesn't go smoothly, so we're afraid the Shemiyata, maybe he'll come to tilt and adjust it and come to be mavir. Shemanim Shamru Chachamim, and the oils that the Chacham said, Ein Madlikim Behem, are disqualified. Why? Mipnei Shein Nimshach Marcha Psila, because it doesn't draw properly. It will not draw the wick, and the heat will not draw the oil, the fuel properly, and therefore we're afraid that it will go out. He'll come to adjust it. Again, the same idea. Shemayat, he'll have to adjust it because it might be dimmed, it might be too dark, it might go out, and he might come to adjust it and come to the Mavir. That's the way Rashi explains it. Tais Rishonim explains because it might go out, and therefore it'll be a pagam and shalom bayis. It'll be in the darkness. The reason the Chacham Masakin Hadlokas Neiris is for shalom bayis. So there should be light in the house on Shabbos, and it might go out, and it might share the shalom bayis. He asked the following Kesha Shema about following Shaila Shemanim Shamru Chacham Mein Madlikim Bem Shabbos. Those oils that the Chacham said are disqualified for Shabbos. Ma'u Sheetin L'Seichen Shemen Kolshu V'Yadlik. Can he put a little bit of oil in them and then use them? Now, if he puts a little bit of valid oil, kosher oil, it will light properly. It will burn properly. So perhaps you'll say that there should be no problem because Lamaisa now is burning properly. However, the shaila is as follows: Mi gazrinan dilma oslad luki beinayu eloi. But it's a shaila: are we geyser that if we will allow you to use it with this mixture, people might think, well, this oil that it has as a component of other shemen, of this type of oil which is disqualified. Let's say shemen kik, it's disqualified. So even though you're adding in some olive oil, but they might think, well, this has shemen kik, that people might think that shemen kik is also good, for instance. So, are we guys that he'll come to light it without the mixture of the kosher oil or not? Amalei and Maliki said you cannot use it. My timer, what's the reason? Lafisha and Maliki, because you can't use the disqualified oil, and in people's eyes, this would be considered using lighting with the disqualified oil. So therefore, even in a case where you mix it with kosher oil, it's still awesome. Eisvil asks you a kash. How can you say that? We learned in the Brisa, Karach Davar Shemadlikin boy, if you wrap something which is valid, which you can use for a wick, Al Gabi Davar Shein Madlikin boy, on top of something that you cannot use, Ein Madlikin boy. You can't use it. It's possible. However, Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, he says, Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, Shebeis Abba, he said, in my father's household, Hayu Karachem Psila Al Gabi Egais, they would wrap a psila, a kosher psila, on a nut which is not kosher, umadlikin, and it would be kosher for hadlokim. So Ketana Mias Madlikim. So you see that if you wrap something kosher on something that's not kosher, that it's valid, that it's kosher, Madlikim. Amalei said, you're asking me a kash from Rishim Gamliel that you see that it's all kosher, that it's valid. Say, Tanakama, bring me a raya for Tanakama because the Tanakama says, Ein Madlikim. Where it says, no, I'll like kosher. That's not a kasha. Maisa Rav, because when he says he testified that shall base Abba Yukarachem. That's a Maisa. He's saying Maisa Shahoya. This is the way they conduct themselves. This is the way they feared. So you see, when it's a Maisa, when we bring down a halacha Maisa, then that shows you that that's the halacha. So that shows you that this was accepted, and this was that the haskama was that this is the way it should be done. So that's the stronger kasha, the kasha from Shimon Gamliel. So that's why he asked from not the Tanakama, he didn't bring a raya for Tanakama, he asked from Shimon Gamliel, Mikol Malkam Kasha. So Mikol Malkam Kasha, you see that by Shimon Gamliel, that this is the way they used to do it. So my love lahadlik, doesn't it mean that it was for the wick? They used something which a kosher wick on the egos, which is not a kosher wick, and it was all used as part of the wick. They used part of the shell of the nut for the wick. It wasn't used for the wick. What they did over there they didn't mean to say that they combined the two materials to make the wick, that they combined the kosher with the non-kosher for the wick. What they did was lahakvas, the nut was just afloat. They wanted to keep the wick, that it shouldn't sink into the oil, that it should float above. So they tied the wick, a kosher wick. The wick was completely kosher, was kulei from kosher material. but they tied it around the nut. They used the nut as a float so that the wick would not sink into the oil. It would stay above, and therefore would light properly. It's lahakvais, and that's why it was kosher. But in Chanami, if it would be a question of combining the two to make the wick, it would be also. So why should the Tanakhama argue with that? If it's only lahakvais to use as a float, why should the Tanakhama argue? The Gemara, he's not arguing. There's no machlekes here. That's not the pshat and the brayz. A cooler of Shimon Gamliel. It's all the opinion of Shimon Gamliel, v'chasura mechsra, and it's missing the following. If you combine with the wick, you combine together something that is kosher for a wick, together with something which is not kosher with the wick. So right now, this wick is composed also of something, a dover, which is not kosher for a wick. It's not kosher. You cannot use it for a wick. But if you're using that for lahadlik, for the wick, if the material that's being used, if the item that's being used is not as a wick but as a float, mutter, it's mutter. And I'll bring you a raya, Shimon ben Gamliel loimer, shal beis abba hayukarchem psila al gabi egos. And you see Lamaisa, that Maisa Rav, that this is what he did. So therefore we see that we're saying that the two items for a wick is Aser, or Geyser. If it's Lahakvas, it's Mutter. But otherwise, that not only is the apostle item apostle for the wick, but even if you combine it with something that's kosher, it's also apostle. And similarly, by the oil, to combine, let's say, for example, olive oil with shemen kik, even though it's burning properly, with still geyser that you might use something which is exclusively shemen kik. How can you say that of Amar Bruna Amar Rab? If you have melted chaylev, or you have the innards of fish, of dogim, so they become melted. So now they're in the liquid state. Adam shemen kolshu madlik. He can put some kosher shemen, some valves, a little bit of it, and now he can use it. It's burning properly. He can use it for the fuel. So you see that we could combine something which is kosher with something which is not kosher. So let's say the same thing by the wick. No, and don't ask me a question from here because this is different. Really, the melted chaylev, the kirbei dagim, the they on their own, really, it burns properly. The wick will draw this oil, it will burn properly. There's really, in itself, no reason to asr it. The only reason we do asr it, so really, hani mimshcha, they draw properly, they burn vahani loy mimshcha, but in the case of the wick that we're talking, it doesn't burn properly. It doesn't draw the oil properly. So hani mimshcha beinayo, vahani loy mimshcha beinayo. This one on its own, if you have for instance, shemen kik. Now, shemen kik on its own does not burn properly. If you mix it with olive oil, it does burn properly, but on its own it doesn't. So we're geyser the mixture because you might come to use the apostle shemen on its own. And same thing with the wicks. But this case over here, the melted chaylev on its own really does burn properly, even if you don't mix it with, for instance, olive oil. So why is it aser? This itself, the melted chaylev, is only aser because if you allow melted chaylev, he might use chaylev which is not melted. So this itself is a gzeira. And why did they aser the kirbei dagim shenimucha? Mishum kirbei dagim shelo nimucha. Now, if it's in the liquid state, the innards of the dog, it really burns properly. In itself, it's only a gzera because you might use kirbei dagim shelo nimucha. So therefore, once you put in kosher oil, let's say olive oil, there's no reason to be geyser anymore. The whole reason that we say the mixture is also, for instance, olive oil with shemen kik, because you might use shemen kik on its own. So therefore we're geyser. But over here, the melted chaylev on its own really does burn properly. So once you mix in olive oil, we're not going to be geyser that perhaps you'll now use the melted chel without the olive oil, because the melted chel without the olive oil really burns properly. And the reason that it's also in itself is only exera. So to be geyser with olive oil with melted chelev, because you might use melted chelev, which in itself is exera, that's considered exera. We won't be geyser then. Fragt more of a lixer nami chelev muhutach kirvei dagim shinuch shenosam l'seicha shemen. We put on oil in it and mishum chelev muhutach kirvei dagim shinuch shaloi nosam l'seicha shemen. No, we go for exera, like we mentioned. This in itself, the melted chelev itself is exera. We're not going to add on another exera that even if you mix it with olive oil, it should be also because, and you might use it on its own, where even using on its own itself is only exera, that you might use it, chelev which is not melted. So therefore that's exera, we won't be geyser. But if, for instance, it's shemen kik with olive oil, there we will be geyser, because you might use shemen kik alone without olive oil. If we see you allow the mixture, he might use something which is exclusively shemen kik, and therefore we were a geyser on that. This that we listen to the Mishnah, that you can't use it on Shabbos, that are not you'd be able to use on Shabbos. You also cannot use it for the menorah in the Beis HaMikdash. It's also for the same reason in the Beis HaMikdash you cannot use it. Now, not for mamash the same reason, because on Shabbos it doesn't burn properly, it flickers, it doesn't draw properly. We're afraid that he might come to be mavir. It's the same reasoning behind it, but why should it be also in the Mikdash? There's no isser on a weekday. There's no isser of being mavir. So what's the problem? Mishum shenemar, the Gemara says lahalois ner tomid, because the pasuk says by the menorah it has to be lahalois ner tomid. Who tanilav who amrlan, and he explains kidei shetei shall have his oil me'alav. The mitzvah of hadlaka of the menorah in the mikdash is such that when you ignite it, when you're madlik it, it has to burn properly. It has to burn, and the flame has to burn without flickering, and it has to be able to draw the oil so that you don't have to constantly adjust. The mitzvah of halakha is such that you're madlik it where it doesn't require adjustments. It has to be lahalis ner tamid, that it's oila me'elah without adjusting. Now these types of wicks and this type of oil, you have to constantly adjust it, so therefore it's possible. So shetei shall have oila me'elah v'lo shetei oila al yedei davar acher. It's not that it burns through adjusting through davar acher.